frame affirmative action in today's debate in terms of the political arena. In terms of politics, we feel affirmative action needs to be actuated there. We're setting this debate in Western liberal democracies. And fundamentally, we say what we want to implement is a system where there are quotas in national legislatures for people who are of sexual preference or belonging from the LGBT group. So these are lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transsexuals. Now, we say the way they have to do this is because they represent 5 to 10% of populations. Proportionally, we'll add 5 to 10% new seats to these legislatures, which are exclusively for people who are openly homosexual, and also, they must be themselves openly from the LGBT community, and also, they're being elected specifically to those seats because they're openly from the LGBT community. Now we say, in terms of minimum representation, so that you get adequate representation of lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transsexuals, there will be minimum quotas within those seats themselves. To say you must have at least 2 lesbians, 2 gays, with varying numbers. So we say maybe in the US legislature this could add up to maybe 20 seats more to the legislature. So essentially the election of these seats can be participated in at a national level by both individuals and political parties. So a political party can put up its candidate who is lesbian or gay, or an individual who is lesbian or gay or bisexual or transsexual can also choose to run for those seats. And the elections will be national in the sense that everyone votes, not just people from the community or from the LGBT community. Now fundamentally our stance in today's debate is that the LGBT community needs to be directly represented in the political discourse. I will talk about that on 3 main levels. Firstly, I'm going to establish the need on 2 levels, that the group is already disenfranchised and not represented in politics. Secondly, how the barriers to entry have little to do with quality and a lot more to do with discrimination. And finally, I'm going to talk about the results of our proposal in terms of representation, participation in discourse, and connectedness of this community to the political process. But before I go into that, I just want to establish a few lines in this debate. This case is largely aspirational. It's what we should do. We're not really looking into whether it can happen or not. The second thing we're looking into is we assume in this debate that everyone considers discrimination against homosexuals unacceptable. That homosexuals or any of people in this community, that the LGBT lifestyle choice is perfectly valid. Now, in terms of things, we're not going to prove in absolutes everything's going to change, but we're going to say there'll be reasonable improvements that come from this debate in terms of the ability to influence discourse, connectedness, as well as role models. We're also going to talk about, why LGBT? Why not everyone else? We're going to say, A, we're happy to include other people. That's the motion. That's a hackneyed response. But the more specific response is because the LGBT community cuts across demographics. It's not just stuck to one ethnic group, one gender, one particular income group. It's cross-cutting, and we see there's a specific need that needs to be represented for this group. We're happy with other groups get it, but it's fine. We're going to focus on this way. Secondly, the other thing is, we want them to tell us why. Firstly, that if we don't have our proposal, can people who are from this community actually be elected into power? And on a second level, we'd also like to find out even if they can't, is it possible for someone who is not from this community to represent this group or this community as well? Because that's what's happening in the status quo. Now let's talk about the 3 levels of analysis. And as part of the split, what MC will be talking about is the context of role models being developed by this proposal. Now, on my first argument, this idea of the group being disenfranchised and not represented. Now I say, in the US, just factually, there's only one openly gay senator, right? The highest representation we see is in countries like Iceland or Scandinavia, where you have transsexuals and bisexuals openly entering parliament. But we say in most Western liberal democracies, and particularly in the context of the United States, there is active legislative discrimination happening against people with alternative sexual preferences. For example, the Defense of Marriage Act, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, Sit Down, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Act, Prop 8, or the various propositions that are emerging in many states that forbid marriage or mandate that marriage can only be between a man and a woman. All this legislature, firstly, in and of itself is discriminating. It creates this double standard that says homosexuals and transsexuals are different from the rest of our population. We have a different standard of how the political process and the laws that emerge from it will deal with them. But more so, we say the discussion happens without these individuals. It happens without them ever being able to have a voice or just being able to say how that would make me feel. The discussion is by people who never experienced that lifestyle, who have no attachment to it, saying that other people should live their lives that way. And even in the case, there are a minority of individuals who represent a minority of individuals who come from this community, because they are elected on a multilateral platform, they can't just push for this issue. They have to represent their constituents on other issues. And that's where we say the focus comes when giving them exclusive seats. Secondly, we say there are barriers to entries. Yes, sir?
Yes, basically your idea on, if you're going to force people to vote for these guys, do you think this is going to lower the discrimination? Because if they are forced to vote for these people, what makes you think, and when they don't want them, how is that going to make them feel better towards these guys?
Firstly, I don't think the discrimination is clear-cut as, they just hate these people. I think to a large extent it's a question of exposure, it's a question of seeing these people in office, and I think NC is going to talk about that a lot more. But more than that, we don't think the discrimination is essentially going to increase. No one loses out because of this proposal. In terms of, they're not losing representation, it's just another group getting representation. In terms of why they can't enter, because we don't think it's an inherent problem of these individuals being bad politicians. We think, to a large extent, the active discrimination that Dave just talked about makes it impossible for someone to be open about their sexual preferences and win seats in election. To a large extent, you can't win an election by saying, I don't believe women should have rights. But you can win it by saying you support family values. And this forces a lot of people from the community into the corner. Finally, in terms of the results from our proposal, because we say the bedrock of democracy is representation. How do you get representation here? We say, firstly, in absolute numbers because you have votes, but more so, you accrue political capital because you have been courted by other parties to help them with their voting, to help them with their policies that they want to push through. So someone who wants to push through a healthcare bill has to talk about you and horse trade with you when you might want to talk about DOMA later on. Secondly, when talking about the participation in discourse, I talked about this earlier in terms of legislation passing without any representation. And finally, we say there's a conversation happening in our streets. This is 5 to 10% of our population who need things to be given to them from their government, who talk among themselves about that state. That discourse not being captured in Parliament results in this community feeling isolated from the political process. That has cost down the line in terms firstly of inserting diversity into that process, but more so making sure our government stay as representative as possible. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, we say direct representation is the only way to help this community. It's the only way that's fair under any state that chooses to call itself a democracy. We're proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for the speech. To open the case for opposition side, I call on the opposition candidate.
Now, Mr. Speaker, what is the line of the opposition? We believe in the idea of organic change within the society. We believe that if these gay people are still subjected to certain amount of criticisms, then we tell you that's the way it should go on. Because we tell you, if you're going to impose and enforce a certain change within the legislation in Parliament, then we tell you, you're going to lead to certain harms and backlashes, which is going to be talked about on the opposition side for today's debate. Now, several problems that I have in the government's case. Firstly, they talk about setting this on the political arena in the Western liberal democracies. Firstly, they did not characterize properly on what the society in the Western liberal democracies thought about gay people, which I'm going to talk about a little bit now. Now, we tell you that gays generally, we see them they are generally acceptable and not acceptable. We are seeing a divided side about this. We tell you that although there are people still going for gays, there are still people against gays. That is why we tell you there's a quota of minimum quota of sit down. There are minimum quota of 5% within this issue because we believe that this is the amount that society feels that needs to be represented. We tell you if you're going to increase to another 5% to this, we tell you this is totally illogical because on what basis did they come up here and tell us? They tell us that these people need to be represented, so we need gays, more gays and more lesbians into this. We tell this not necessarily the case because, for example, if we want to talk about a bill about abortion, right? We don't believe that you need pregnant ladies around here to actually decide on a bill about abortion. Exactly the same with gays. We tell you that if you want to talk about gay rights, you don't necessarily need gays there. Although it will be better for you to have gays. That's why we tell you we have the minimal representation of 5% in the quotas right now. We tell you we believe that status quo is fine with going with the organic change to society. Next, we tell you that legislation again is the representation of the people. We tell you if you're going to pass a bill, it must be in favor with what people think about them. So we tell you if you're going to enforce a quota of another 5%, which we probably see 10% in Parliament right now, we tell you that they are not necessarily being represented by society. Even though they undergo the same election process, even though they go through the same manifestos and so on and so forth, the people do not really have a right to actually choose who they want to elect, because you have to put a political leader who is maybe gay or lesbian or transsexual and so on up there, because you have to fill in the quota. So we tell you if this is necessarily the case, then the people will not actually have the right to actually elect the people they want, because in the very first place you have to put someone which they dislike. So we have a problem with this as well. Now let's go on with what they talk about some more. Now basically in the end they tell us that we need a change in the political arena, right? They believe that gays needs to be empowered. However, we are going to directly clash with this issue, because we tell you you are going to harm the gay community as a whole. Because I'm going to talk about the first substantive, which concerns why it is principally wrong to actually pass this bill just because they have a different kind of sexual orientation. And I'm going to talk about two levels of harm in today's debate. Before this, yes.
You're mistaken, there is no 5 to 10% quota now. But since you've said that if you assume it actually does exist now and you've accepted it, are you then conceding that the needs that I've outlined are those that need to be addressed?
Now, it is not me who decide what are the needs and the outlines. It is the society that decides what are the needs and the outlines. If society feels that this certain amount of quota should be there, then it should be there. We tell you, you cannot be at the state to simply add another 5 to 10% because that is a wrong issue to talk about. Have a seat, you have your chance. Now, let me go forward with my substantive. Why is it principally wrong for these sexual minorities, right, to be seen as a disadvantaged group and be given affirmative action? Because to understand, you need to understand what is affirmative action. We tell you affirmative action is basically to help a disadvantaged group, to help the helpless and those who are unable to fend for themselves. However, we don't see sexual minorities as this way, because we see them as they have the freedom to speech. They can voice out opinions for themselves. They can hold on for their own rights. And we are telling you that these people, they are rational minded and they are no different from normal people, and the only difference they have is they have a different sexual orientation. We tell you that you're going to bring several kinds of harms if you are going to go on with this issue. Firstly, you're going to put the spotlight on this kind of homosexuals when society is not even ready to accept it. Why? This is because we tell you that you're going to put these people under public scrutiny now. Even when they are not really quite acceptable in society. We tell you, you are actually going to accumulate the gay community, the sexual minorities, LGBT in a way. This is because you're going to equate these kind of people with the disadvantaged groups, such as people with broken arms and broken legs, or perhaps people with who are mentally unsound. Because we tell you, we don't see these people as a disadvantaged group. But we only stand for this issue because we tell you we need to follow on the society's needs and preference, and the bill should go on with this way. You cannot simply add something on just because you believe it is right when the society don't accept it. Because we're talking about legislature here, right? We're talking about passing on bills, and you cannot pass a bill just because you want to ensure there's 10% representation of people with a different kind of sexual orientation. We tell people should be represented based on the community that selects them, based on other more important issues that are needed to be seen, not sexual orientation. Next, we tell you are going to degrade the value of sexual minorities as a whole, because we see this as a form of active discrimination towards these sexual minorities. How is it an active discrimination, right? Firstly, the government is going to elect a bill that tells you you are weak, you are helpless. We are going to put you under public scrutiny where public don't even accept you yet. We are going to put you under public scrutiny for the public to actually criticize you even more on your sexual orientations when you are not even readily accepted by the society. We tell you that this form of active discrimination is unnecessary when the society is not even ready to accept this issue. How do we know society is not ready? We see Proposition 8 coming out recently, right? Where they actually banned gay marriages in California. So we can tell you that society is not really ready to accept this kind of this kind of people with this kind of sexual minorities. So we tell you that as a government, what is the best way for you to go with it? We tell you that yes, you can go on and give more chance for these people to actually debate about their rights, and so on and so forth. We tell you that when you reach to a level acceptable within the society, then only you can put forward more representation or even demolish the quota after all, because we tell you in the end, organic change will come. For example, now, what kind of organic change can we see? For example, in Rome, right, when we talk about different kinds of political ideologies moving on, we see this as a form of organic change. We tell you organic change is better because the society internally accepts the issue. So, what have I talked about in today's debate? I showed to the hall on two levels of harm, right? Firstly, on the harm of where you are going to actively discriminate these people, and also on the harm of their dignity, where because you are going to devalue these people in the eyes of the public, you are going to tell them you are now on the same level, you are below a class of society. And we tell for all these right reasons, we are very proud to oppose the case.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I thank the leader of opposition for his speech. Further the case for government, call upon the Prime Minister.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, Madam Chair, before I start my first argument, I want to ask a question to the opposition teams, right? If laws set the norms of what you acceptable behavior of the society, how can you change that laws if LGBT people is not in the position of changing the law at the first place? These are questions they must answer at the second speaker. With that, I have one argument. Why our policy have a positive impact of the society? A, to the people LGBT themselves, and B, to the people who is non-LGBT, who is living in this society. Before moving on to my first argument, I'm going to give us some cases from the opposition teams. Firstly, they said it is principally wrong. This is reverse discrimination, right? A, we just add 5 or 10% of the people to the recent legislations, right? So there is no compromisations. You must give up some of the people just for pick these people because you will just add on more something, right? B, it influences the people who see the LGBT politicians whose success in front of their eyes. And I think it has a powerful and influence to the society. And in all the democratic society, if there is a misrepresentations and less representation, we always introduce these kind of affirmative actions. Like Tate saying, in India and Afghanistan, there is women's affirmative action in politics quota in the first place. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, they said other people can representations. How naive, right? There's several reasons why other people can represent these peoples, right? First, they said that the example was there is a woman, right? First, there is woman already in the politics, right? They can change. But the problems of LGBT people is there is non-LGBT people at the first place. These people have a unique sexual orientations, right? These people have a different interest to the peoples. And thirdly, in the society, sadly and unfortunately, there is a social norms strong against these LGBT peoples, right? When politicians then strongly say in front of the public, go the position with favor with these peoples, there are high possibility they will lose the vote because there's a social norms which is created at the first place. Then they talked about we humiliate these peoples because we just make them as same as handicapped peoples, right? Firstly, we don't. We just said these peoples are politically misrepresented. What we're trying to do is we just let the people know these people are politically misrepresented because of a social norms, which is not true at the first place. And our policy can successfully change these untrue and bad misconceptions. Yes?
So you cannot stop the perceptions of society. The minute they see affirmative action, which is always carried out for those who are disadvantaged, like the like the handicapped and all those people, they will immediately think that these people are below them, no matter what your ideas may be.
Okay, firstly, they never provided any examples. They just said all the affirmative action is failed. Please give me examples, right? And India and Afghanistan, we clearly said there is quota system exists there, which is successful. And they said society is not ready politically, right? But my question is, when the change can be there, if just social norms and everything is set, they must say when we can make the society ready for the LGBT people can represent themselves in terms of politicians and political ideas. And moving on to my first argument, impact on the society. A, LGBT themselves, and B, non-LGBT people who are living in the society, right? Let's look at the real society. There are a lot of social norms because of media, right? Always media just describe these people have a problems. They just spread the disease, HIV, they just have a bad sexual preference. These things established at the first place as media. And people use, when they just want to humiliate the other peoples, they just use the words of LGBT peoples, right? I think some of people have this experience. And church, which is the strongest institution, which have a lot of influence, they have a strong stance, go against these peoples. Religious organizations, they always said these people choice is wrong at the first place, these people cannot exist at the first place. And political institutions, there's no politicians, right? These kind of truths and society and reality makes the bad social norms and stigmatization to the peoples. And what is the impact of our mothers? First, LGBT people themselves. Like most of the LGBT person, they don't want to express their own identity, right? But why this is the problem, Mr. Speaker? All the people must recognize themselves, their own identity. There is a pursuit of their own happiness. But at the first place, it's impossible because they are afraid of bad discrimination from the other peoples. But why politicians can change these ideas? A, the LGBT people themselves sees the success of the peoples, right? And the ideas just contrast ideal social norms in the society because other people just consider these people as a second-class citizen. But our people inside of LGBT, they can be in the media. They say to the peoples, I can make the law, I can using the handle of the country and making a better society. These kind of impact have a lot of nice things to the peoples because people themselves inside of LGBT, I'm not the second citizens. Look at politicians who is success on the at the first place in the media. These kind of positive impact make them try more and work more and realize themselves as an identity. And second, non-LGBT peoples. I'm not saying all the people is going to positively impact our mothers. We see the peoples who have a neutral stance, but because of social norms, they just swayed against the LGBT peoples because they never see success of the peoples and they just face always social norms, right? When people adjudicating other peoples, they always see the consequence and result. When politicians doing nice job as the LGBT politicians, when they doing a positive impact on the society, their conceptions and norms will highly likely change because they can see now these peoples have the same ability with us. Even I can't, but people we just consider as a second-class citizens, they can change a lot of things over our society. I think this impact has a huge impact to the society. Why? Many people is going to be persuaded by these ideas, right? They think these people can have the same ability. These people can give a nice treatment, or when in the job from president and CEO, they can hire more people because their conception is not there anymore. For those reasons, I'm very proud to propose this motion.
Mr. Speaker, it's interesting to see how side government thinks that they can force society to simply change their perception, and that is the discrimination towards these sexual minorities. They think they can solve this problem by forcing people to vote for people whom they were initially discriminating against. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to put it to you that this isn't going to work because, first of all, they didn't want these people in there, so if you force them to do something, they're not going to do this you're not going to do this because they felt it was the best choice for their country, but because they were forced to, Mr. Speaker. Now look, Mr. Speaker, being forced into this is not going to change their perceptions at all. Now, first of all, Mr. Speaker, we have to see that many people just have reasons behind this discrimination towards these people in the first place. Now look, these discriminations didn't just spring up overnight, Mr. Speaker. No, there were reasons. For example, religious reasons. Many people in the world, the majority of the people in the world have religions, and most religions are against gay in the first place, Mr. Speaker. The majority of the world sees this. But Mr. Speaker, if you wish to debate on your terms where they basically say that nobody is speaking up for these gays, right, Mr. Speaker? No. They basically think that we have to force people to allow these gays into parliament, into the legislature in the first place because there's nobody taking action for them. But Mr. Speaker, I'm going to put it to you, despite the fact that a lot of people in this world are discriminating, you will still see people who aren't gays, by the way, are taking action for these gays in the first place because they recognize some of these people's rights, Mr. Speaker. These gays are not alone in the world, Mr. Speaker. No, they're not alone in the world. They already have people speaking up for them. For example, Mr. Speaker, President Obama himself is taking steps to scrap the don't ask, don't tell policy. No. We can see, Mr. Speaker, that there are already politicians who already think that gays deserve these rights, Mr. Speaker. So it follows, Mr. Speaker, that these guys aren't alone. You don't need to force people whom the people aren't going to vote for anyway into the legislature. No. It's basically going to cut down their credibility if they are forced into this in the first place, Mr. Speaker. That was basically what the first speaker talked about. Moving on to the second speaker, sir, first of all, he basically came up and talked about how. Oh yes, what?
Your side has talked about organic change, meaning that you guys express a desire as well to reduce the discrimination against homosexuals in society. How exactly does your side plan to do this? Because I haven't heard anything from either your...
No, you see, Mr. Speaker, steps are currently being taken slowly and properly the way they should be. We are actually seeing the president coming out and talking to us, trying to convince us. That is happening organically because we are seeing the non-gays themselves starting to accept the gays. Now, if you force a gay in there and make him start forcing his ideals on the people, that's not going to be organic. That's going to be a huge change. Now, the second speaker came out and talked about all the influence. How if these gays get in successfully, it's going to influence the whole world. Mr. Speaker, it's not exactly a success the way they got in because these people were forced to vote for them in the first place. It's not exactly a success. Now, if they got in despite all the discrimination, that would be inspiring success. But if you force them in, Mr. Speaker, they got in by default, and it's going to be looked down on, Mr. Speaker, not inspired. And, oh yes, they basically said that, again, he said that affirmative this is not of humiliating these people, but Mr. Speaker, affirmative action is carried out for those without certain benefits. In other words, those who need the help. So now, I don't care what they say, the point is society has its views. And if they think affirmative action is being carried out for a person, they will think that there's something that they are beneath the rest of us. Now, he brought up the impact of this. First of all, Mr. Speaker, he basically said... No, I really must get moving. First of all, Mr. Speaker, he talked about how he basically brought up again, people are scared of discrimination, but if you force people to vote for these gays, then they'll look very good. Mr. Speaker, they got in by default. The people themselves weren't happy with having to vote for them, but they had to, Mr. Speaker. They did not get in by success at all, but because it was by default. No. Secondly, they basically brought up the fact that the media is describing them as problems and basically the religious guys are against them and all stuff. Mr. Speaker, I've already shown you, people are taking steps to confirm these gay rights. And I'd like to see somebody write something in media to say openly go out against gays, Mr. Speaker, because if they did that, they'd face major issues with the people. They'd probably get sued and all that stuff. And basically... No. And basically they brought up that nonsense about how those people who are neutral anyway are following the majority. No, Mr. Speaker, because if that's the case, we wouldn't be seeing people taking steps to help to support gay rights in the first place, Mr. Speaker. Now, moving on to my first substantive of the day, Mr. Speaker, that would be the topic of abuse. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you allow this policy to carry out, there are political benefits. Basically, gays are gonna be allowed to go into the legislature. No. Now, Mr. Speaker, what's gonna happen here? People actually do want to get into the legislature, so people may end up lying about their sexuality. They could end up coming and say, hey, I'm bisexual, or I'm gay, or I'm lesbian, Mr. Speaker. Now look, it's impossible to gauge these guys to see whether or not they are actually real. So how exactly, government has not come up here and shown how exactly we're going to show these guys are gays. So if you carry out the policy, how are you going to stop people from carrying out fraud? Because it's not like other cases of fraud where you can check somebody's background or do run checks. Because, no. Because this gayness, Mr. Speaker, is basically a state of mind. How are you going to test their sexuality, Mr. Speaker? How are you going to see if they're bisexual or gay? Are you going to make two men stand in the same room, take off their pants and see whether they arouse each other? Because no, Mr. Speaker, you can't really do that at all. Mr. Speaker, no, you cannot test this, and this leads to room for abuse, Mr. Speaker, because certain people are going to want to get into the politics so bad, Mr. Speaker, that they come up to you and start lying about their sexuality. They will come up and say, "Hey, I'm gay," and you have no way to test it, Mr. Speaker. You cannot read their minds. You cannot tell. No, you cannot tell just what it is that leads them to that their sexuality is about, Mr. Speaker. So how exactly are you going to stop cases of fraud? Blatant abuse is going to happen if you allow this. Now, moving on to my second substandard of the day, Mr. Speaker, that would be the perception of the other disadvantaged groups, whom the affirmative action is actually carried out for, Mr. Speaker. You see, these are the guys who these are the guys who rarely need the help, Mr. Speaker, because they have disadvantages here and there. Now, Mr. Speaker, these sexual minorities aren't exactly disadvantaged in a sense, because nowadays we do actually see people for them. They're not exactly completely alone in the world, are they, Mr. Speaker? No, these guys don't need the help the same way most of the other groups do, Mr. Speaker. Now, because they don't require this help, while certain groups do require the help, Mr. Speaker, these other groups are going to feel shoved aside. They're going to feel resentment because they know the help provided, Mr. Speaker, is completely unnecessary because there are already people providing help for these gays themselves, Mr. Speaker, of their own volition without affirmative action. So these guys who really do need affirmative action, Mr. Speaker, are going to see this as a waste of time and resources just for a group that doesn't even need the affirmative action, when the people who really do need the affirmative action, Mr. Speaker, are just being shoved aside for this. They're not going to take this lying down, Mr. Speaker. Now, what have I talked to you today, Mr. Speaker? First of all, I've talked about how this policies by side government is going to lead to abuse by people. And secondly, I've talked about the perception of the other disadvantaged groups and how it's going to lead to resentment and basically a whole lot of backlash from them. And so for these reasons, Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud to oppose the case.
Yeah.